Hello, welcome to this online training session covering the Adult Safeguarding Risk Matrix and Thresholds tool. I'm Jonathan Burrows. I'm the Safeguarding Adults Partnership Business Manager.
Hi everyone, I'm Nikki Chester. I'm the Safeguarding Adults Partnership Training Manager.
In the session today, we're going to talk through different types of adult safeguarding abuse and neglect and how you can use the new Risk Matrix and Thresholds tool to help you in putting referrals in. Some background to why the tool has been developed. Adult social care safeguarding has gone through some changes in January 2024. That service was redesigned, and we've worked really hard as a partnership to make sure that we get the right referrals into the right place at the right time. As a partnership, we've seen high numbers of referrals into the front door that don't progress to a safeguarding inquiry. And for that individual, we could have seen a more appropriate and a quicker response had that referral been sent elsewhere. Colleagues working in the provider in the care home sector will note that we've moved away from harm levels reporting, and we've seen examples of adult consent being overridden or referrals into the portal where the adult wasn't fully aware of what the implications of that meant. So all of this means that we need a tool and an approach that correctly covers adult safeguarding in the right way at the right time. That's led to the development of this new approach. What we are hoping is that this tool will provide a standardized approach on how we work with adults through a safeguarding process. The tool that we're talking through today is a resource for all professionals who work across Stockport to identify the type of risk and be specific about the level of risk that that individual is experiencing at that time. Identify the specific type of abuse or neglect that that individual is experiencing. Being clear on how to include the individual in their safeguarding process. That is a process that we call making safeguarding personal, and we'll explain what that means. And overall, know how to make referrals into the local authority and where to seek support in the community where that threshold hasn't been reached. Before we go further, it's helpful just to cover off what we mean when we talk about the criteria for making a safeguarding adult concern to the local authority. This criteria is set out in the Care Act, and there are three broad headings that we'll talk through. First of all, we need to understand, does that person have care and support needs? This list isn't exhaustive, but some examples that might help you in identifying that. Are they an older person? Do they have some sort of physical disability, a learning difficulty, or a sensory impairment? Do they have any long-term health conditions? Or are they known to misuse substances or alcohol to the extent that it affects their ability to manage day-to-day living? The second criteria looks at whether the person is experiencing or is at risk of experiencing abuse or neglect. And pulling this together, the third section looks at, as a result of their care and support needs, is that individual unable to protect themselves from either the risk or the actual experience of abuse or neglect? If we can answer yes to those three questions, then the threshold's been met and we can make a safeguarding adult concern to the local authority. Once that concern's been made to the local authority, it's really important that we consider some immediate steps and to think about what will happen next. So if that adult is at risk of experiencing immediate abuse or neglect or harm, it's really important that we take any immediate steps to put that person in a safe space. Think about their protection needs and their immediate needs at that time. It's also really important that we talk to that person and obtain their consent. Are they happy for us to make that referral to the local authority, or do we need to think about acting against their wishes in their best interests? We need to think about preserving any evidence that might support any claims or concerns or safeguarding inquiries. And we need to inform the agency responsible for working with that adult what actions we are taking. At the end of this, write all this down and report those concerns to the local authority, being really specific and clear on that level of harm and abuse or neglect that the adult's taking. And the tool that we're going to talk through will help you to identify and be clear on what that looks like. This next section is talking about what we call making safeguarding personal. This is a phrase some of you may be aware of and some of you may not. It comes about from the Care Act, and there's statutory guidance that puts an emphasis on getting the balance right between promoting safety and respecting the views and wishes of the individual concerned. It's really important in safeguarding that we don't make decisions and choices about that person without their involvement and their consent. This is what we've referred to as making safeguarding personal, and the idea is that it leads to better outcomes for that individual through that safeguarding process. There is guidance that is put out there from the Care Act 2014, and that's intended to support professionals, local authorities, other services, partner agencies to develop outcome-focused, person-centered safeguarding practice where we place that individual at the center of all work we are doing from a safeguarding perspective.
So how do you make safeguarding personal? And this is not an exhaustive list, it's just some examples that you can think of when we're thinking about making safeguarding personal. So listen to the person or their advocate or representative where applicable. Find out what they actually want to do about their situation, being that person-centered. Respond in appropriate manner and work at a pace that suits the individual and their circumstances. We shouldn't be driven by organisational processes or timescales. Again, being that person-centred and looking at what that individual actually wants to happen in their circumstances. Support staff and allow them to use the skills, the knowledge and the judgment when they're supporting individuals around making safeguarding personal. And focus on the outcomes that the individual has identified. Keep checking what they want along the way. Keep reviewing things, keep going back, making sure that, again, you've got that person-centered approach. Ensure the individual is central to any decisions concerning them and that they are supported to attend meetings and kept informed of any progress. Reflect on our safeguarding practice to ensure that we are doing the best that we can to support people. And evaluate interventions to be clear that the individuals we work with are satisfied with our interventions. In relation to the tool, you'll see that it covers all elements of abuse. So we're going to look at what abuse may be. And that is a single act or repeated acts. It's an act of neglect or a failure to act. It can be multiple acts. For example, an adult at risk may be neglected and also being financially abused. Abuse is about the misuse of power and control that one person has over another. It can happen in settings such as the person's own home. It can be at a daycare centre, a residential centre, supported housing, educational establishments, or in nursing homes, clinics, or hospitals. Just a few quotes here from the Department of Health and the Home Office. No secrets. Abuse is the violation of an individual's human or civil rights by any other person or persons. So again, relating back to that power and control that another person has over, that a person has over another. Again, a quote from the Safeguarding Adults and Children with Learning Disabilities Against Abuse from the Council of Europe 2002. Abuse is any act or failure to act which results in a significant breach of a vulnerable person's human rights, civil liberties, bodily integrity, dignity or general well-being, whether intended or inadvertent, including sexual relationships or financial transactions to which a person may not or cannot validly consent or which are deliberately exploitative. So that just brings it together what abuse is. And under the Care Act, as defined by the Care Act 2014, and as recognised by the CQC, there are 10 types of abuse. As you can see on the PowerPoint, we have physical abuse, financial material abuse, sexual abuse, emotional or psychological abuse, discriminatory abuse, organisational abuse, neglect, self-neglect, domestic abuse, and modern slavery.
So when we're talking about how we use the tool to be really clear and specific around the types of abuse and neglect that an adult may experience, there are two things that we've already spoken about in the PowerPoint that are really integral to the tool. The first is about prioritizing that making safeguarding personal approach. It promotes putting the individual at the center of the process because they are the expert in their experience. When we talk through the tool, we'll see there are specific prompts where we ask the adult if they've consented to that safeguarding referral being put in, if they've consented to any actions that are being taken, and where we need to override consent. It also touches on looking at the adult's mental capacity and any considerations that we need to take into account to promote their well-being. The tool provides a standardized approach to managing risk and how to understand risk-taking behaviors that adults may engage in. So we're now going to look at some signs and indicators around different types of abuse or neglect. The following list is just some examples of those possible signs and indicators. It doesn't cover all eventual possibilities or examples. There may be other indicators that might cause you concern as a professional, or you might not be able to put your finger on exactly what is worrying you. Remember, if at any point you have concerns or you're worried, it's important that you seek out advice from either your agency safeguarding lead, your line manager, or the local authority. The presence of one of the following signs and indicators does not prove that abuse or neglect is occurring or has occurred, but it may suggest the situation needs to be looked into.
So the first type of abuse, physical abuse, and that may be where you see that an individual has been hit, slapped, or they've been scratched. They may have been pushed, or they may have been handled roughly. They may have been restrained without any justifiable reason. Physical abuse, there may be misuse of medication. And on some occasions, inappropriate sanctions, including deprivation of food, clothing, warmth, and healthcare needs. On some occasions, an individual may have been force-fed. And look at some of the signs and indicators around physical abuse. There may be a history of unexplained falls or minor injuries, especially at different stages of healing. There may be on an individual unexplained bruising in well-protected areas of the body, and that may be on the inside of the thighs or the upper arms. There may be a sign and indicator that there is unexplained bruising or injuries of any kind. There may be burn marks of an unusual type, and that may be burns caused by cigarettes or rope burns, or where the adult appears to have been dipped, and that relates to scalding with it in water. Maybe that there's a prolonged interval between an injury or illness and presentation for medical care and attention. So, like Jonathan said, it's not an exhaustive list, but these are just some examples that that an individual could be subjected to.
When we look at sexual abuse, some of the examples here can include the rape or attempted rape or sexual assault of an individual. It can include inappropriate touching anywhere on the body, non-consensual masturbation of either both persons, non-consensual sexual penetration or attempted penetration. It can be any sexual activity that the person lacks that capacity to consent to, and it can also include inappropriate looking, teasing, innuendo, or sexual harassment. This also can include photography or the forced use of pornography. Some signs and indicators to look out for in this category can be unexplained changes in the demeanor or behavior of the individual. They might have a tendency to withdraw and spend time in isolation. They might be displaying irregular and disturbed sleeping patterns. They may have bruising or bleeding. There may be some form of self-mutilation. They might have difficulty in walking and or sitting with no apparent explanation. And they might have torn, stained, or bloody clothes.
Psychological abuse covers quite a number of elements. And that could include emotional abuse. It could be that verbal, that humiliation, that ridicule of an individual. It could be threats of punishment, abandonment, intimidation, or exclusion from services. It could be that individual is isolated or withdrawn from services or supportive networks. And it could be around the psychological abuse, that deliberate denial of religious or cultural needs. Failure to provide access to appropriate social skills and educational development training. And some of those signs and indicators around psychological abuse is that inability of the person to sleep or tendency to spend long periods in bed. So very lethargic, have no energy, loss of appetite or overeating in inappropriate times. It may be that that person is anxious, that they're very confused. It may be that they're very withdrawn and isolated. And it may be that they do show signs of low self-esteem. It could be that the person does become withdrawn, does become anxious, does become depressed. And it may be that whilst if psychological abuse is present, that a person is uncooperative and shows that aggressive behaviour.
When we're looking at financial or material abuse, this can include examples such as the misuse or theft of money, fraud and extortion of material assets, the misuse or misappropriation of property, possessions, or benefits, exploitation or pressure in connection with wills, property, or inheritance. And some signs and indicators to look out for can include the unexplained or inability to pay for household shopping or bills, the withdrawal or the continual withdrawal of large sums of money which cannot easily be explained, personal possessions that go missing without explanation, or a disparity between the person's living conditions and their financial resources. This can include unusual and extraordinary interest and involvement in a vulnerable adult's assets by another person.
Neglect and acts of omission. So you may have an individual who's ignoring medical or physical care needs, the failure to give prescribed medication, that failure to provide access to appropriate health, appropriate social care or educational services. It might be that neglect around accommodation, which could cover the heating, lighting, failure to access care or equipment for functional independence, and a failure to give privacy and dignity to that individual. And this will include professional neglect. Some of the signs and indicators that you may see around neglect and acts of omission is that the carers are reluctant to accept contact from health or social care professionals. They refuse to arrange access for visitors. There's poor physical condition in the vulnerable person, so they may have pressure sores, ulcers, bed sores. It may be apparent that there is an unexplained weight loss, that the individual is unkempt, with the clothing and their appearance. They may not actually be provided with appropriate and inadequate clothing, and some sensory deprivation, so lack of access to glasses, hearing aids. There may be an absence of appropriate privacy and dignity, and there may be an absence of method of calling for assistance, so which causes that malnutrition, again, ulcers, bed sores, and being left in wet clothing.
Looking at discriminatory abuse, this can include discrimination demonstrated on any grounds, including sex, race, colour, language, culture, religion, politics, or sexual orientation. It can include discrimination that's based on a person's disability or their age. It can include harassment and slurs which can be degrading for that individual, and it can include hate crimes. Some signs and indicators for discriminatory abuse can include a tendency to withdraw and that individual feeling isolated. They can be fearless or have a general anxiety. They might be refusing access to services or being excluded inappropriately. They can display a loss of self-esteem. You might feel some sort of resistance or refusal to access services that are required to meet that person's needs. And they might display an expression of anger or frustration.
Organisational abuse. And that may be where, in just an example, in a care setting where they're discouraging visits or the involvement of relatives or friends. It may be that that establishment is run down or overcrowded. It may be that the management has that authoritarian and rigid regimes. It may be that that organisation, that establishment has that lack of leadership and that supervision. And it may be that there is insufficient staff or a high turnover resulting in poor quality care. Abusive and disrespectful attitudes towards people using their service, inappropriate use of restraints, and that service not providing adequate food and drink or assistance with eating, not offering any choice or promoting independence for that individual, or there may be a misuse of medication. And some of those signs and indicators that you may see around organisational abuse is that lack of flexibility in the choice for people using the service. Maybe inadequate staffing levels. It may be that you see that people are hungry or dehydrated, and that's where we see those poor standards of care. There may be lack of personal clothing and possessions of communal use of personal items. It may be that there's lack of adequate procedures, poor record keeping, and missing documents. It may be within that establishment that there are no visitors, that there is an absence with visitors, that there are no recreational or educational activities, and the public discussion of personal matters. They may display unnecessary exposure during bathing or using the toilet, and there may be an absence of an individual care plan, which, bringing this all together, they may show that lack of management overview and support.
Looking at modern slavery here, this can include some examples such as forced labour and or debt bondage, child slavery, forced marriage, the sexual or criminal exploitation of an individual, domestic servitude, and human trafficking. Some signs and indicators that can help you look out for and spot modern slavery can include that person showing signs of physical or psychological abuse. They may look malnourished, unkempt, or appear withdrawn. They may rarely be allowed to travel on their own. It might seem like they're under some sort of control or influence by another person or another group, and they rarely interact or appear unfamiliar with their neighbourhood or where they work. They may be living in dirty, cramped, or overcrowded accommodation, and there might be numerous people living and working at that same address. Victims may have a history of crime, which can include things like shoplifting, and that individual may not have identification documentation. They may have few personal possessions and always wear the same clothes day in, day out. Think about what clothes they're wearing and whether that's suitable for the work that that person is doing.
For domestic abuse can be characterised by any of the indicators of abuse, which we've outlined in this briefing, and that includes psychological, physical, sexual, financial, and emotional. Domestic abuse include any incident of patterns of incidents of controlling, coercive or threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over who are or have been intimate partners or family members, regardless of gender or sexuality. So with domestic abuse, you will find that all the indicators, there will be an element of coercion and control embedded in all of the indicators within domestic abuse. So with that, if there is physical abuse, there will be coercion and control. If there is financial abuse, there will be coercion and control. It also includes so-called honour-based violence, female genital mutilation, and forced marriage. Like I said before, coercion or controlling behaviour is a core part of domestic violence and is embedded in all of the characteristics. Again, we have spoke about some of these previously, but some of the signs and indicators may be that low self-esteem. There may be that they're feeling that the abuse is their fault when it's not. There may be some of that victim blaming. There may be signs of physical evidence of violence, such as bruising, cuts and broken bones. It may be that you see that verbal abuse and humiliation in front of others. It may be fear of outside intervention, damage to the home or property, isolation with them not being able to see their family and friends, and it may be with that financial element that they have limited access to money.
Looking at self-neglect here, this can include a lack of self-care to the extent that it threatens that individual's personal health and safety. It can include neglecting to care for your own personal hygiene, health, or environment and surroundings. It might be the inability to avoid any form of self-harm, or the failure to seek help or access services to meet health and social care needs. And it can include the inability or unwillingness to manage your own personal affairs. Some signs and indicators can include very poor personal hygiene, that individual looking quite unkempt. They might lack essential food, clothing, or shelter. They may appear to be malnourished or dehydrated, and they might live in squalid or unsanitary conditions. They may neglect household maintenance, or they may hoard and collect items. They may not always comply with health or care services, and there might be a general inability or unwillingness to take medication or treat illness or injury. So, thinking about those specific types of abuse or neglect there, we're going to talk about how we use the tool. Now, the safeguarding thresholds and risk matrix tool isn't designed to replace any process or portal or referral method that we have in Stockport, but it's designed to have in your back pocket as a professional to help you in that decision-making process to put that safeguarding referral in. It's designed for any multi-agency professional to use before making a referral into the local authority. It doesn't replace any current forms, processes, or pathways, but it should strengthen that decision-making and clarity around the level of risk when safeguarding issues are identified. For most types of abuse and neglect within the tool, it's RAG rated into red, amber, and green, which equates into low, medium, and high levels of risk and abuse. And it points out how to respond in those situations. However, there are certain types of abuse and neglect where we say that individuals should always be referred into the local authority, and we should be having that discussion around that level of risk that person faces. So in terms of how we use this in practice, at the first sign of some sort of concern being identified within the community, within that work, that interaction with that person, or just as a one-off occurrence, we're starting to spot some of those signs and indicators of abuse or neglect that we've spoken about. To help you in deciding what actions to take from that point, you can consult the risk matrix and safeguarding thresholds tool to understand the level of risk and type of abuse or neglect that person is either currently experiencing or might be at risk of experiencing. Depending on where that falls out after consulting with the tool, that professional can take the most appropriate course of action, putting that person at the center of that choice and making safeguarding personal. This means that where cases are referred into adult social care in the local authority, that safeguarding referral includes specific information on the level of risk and the type of abuse that person is at risk of experiencing or is actually experiencing. So the first section in the tool looks at how we assess that adult at risk. In this section, we look at the abusive act and the level of risk or severity. So we're looking at the seriousness of abuse. Are there any patterns of abuse? What is the impact on that victim? What's the impact on others involved? Is there any intent of that alleged perpetrator? Are there any illegality? And is there a risk of repeated incident? For each of those areas of concern, you can see the tool here splits out into low, medium, or high risk. And there are some considerations to think about when you are assessing that level of risk the adult is facing. Once we're clear on that level of risk, we then start to think about the type of abuse or neglect that that adult is facing. So this list runs through the types of abuse or neglect that we've already covered in this briefing, and it just has a very brief description on what that might look like. We've also included some additional types of abuse or neglect. On the bottom of this list here, you can see that includes pressure ulcers, slip, strips and falls, and medication errors. So as well as the Care Act statutory types of abuse or neglect, we've included some additional examples there, where you can get a brief description of what that risk of harm might look like and how we can respond. And finally, once we're clear on what that level of risk looks like, once we're clear on the type of abuse or neglect, we can move into assessing what actions we need to take. We can determine the most appropriate response for that individual. So this is the third section within the tool. And you can see there down the left-hand side, there are different types of abuse or neglect that we've talked about. And for each of those, there was a green or a low level of risk. In these instances, we would say that is not a safeguarding concern. It can be managed either internally or referred elsewhere. So for example, physical abuse, we might be looking at a minor injury that can be explained and that does not require a skilled medical response. There's little to no lasting impact on that individual. Where we move across into a more severe level of risk, we're in the amber column in the middle. This is what we would call medium risk in the tool. And this is where we need to start screening for a possible safeguarding concern. We might want to seek advice from our designated safeguarding lead in our agency, or we may just want a conversation with the local authority. So again, using physical abuse as the example here, we might look at a risk of a recurring injury or harm which may indicate a pattern of abuse. The individual may require some sort of medical attention, but is expected to make a full recovery. Finally, on the right hand, we are at high risk. This is the red column there. And this is where we would say there is no question that that individual should be referred as a safeguarding into the local authority. So again, using physical abuse as the example here, we might be looking at an injury that results in disability or ongoing significantly increased care and support needs for that person. The injury will likely need immediate skilled medical attention and is likely to have some sort of lasting impact for that person. You can see the tool then works down different types of abuse or neglect until we reach the bottom 3 rows here. These are sexual abuse, domestic abuse, and we've also included female genital mutilation in here. What we say in these instances, you can see it runs across the 3 columns there. Wherever we know or suspect an individual has experienced or is at risk of experiencing any of those 3 types of abuse or neglect, they should always be referred into the local authority as an immediate safeguarding concern. And we should also be thinking about what steps we can take as professionals to move that adult into a place of safety. There are some examples there, some definitions that you can see to help identify those types of abuse or neglect. But in those instances, we would always say, don't risk assess that as low, medium or high, and put that referral into the local authority.
Just going to run through a case study, and I'm just going to introduce you to Peter. Peter is a 79-year-old gentleman who lives in a residential home and has been for the last 5 years. Peter has a diagnosis of dementia. He is assisted with his personal care, and the carer supporting Peter noticed that he has extensive bruising on his right side. The carer reports this to yourself, and after reviewing Peter's fall logs, there are no reported falls. So what we would kind of ask you is, what do you need to know to guide the level of risk? What questions do you need to ask to gain this information? So in relation to Peter, to assess the risk, you need to understand how the bruising occurred and the events that led up to this. Through making the above initial inquiries, you may be able to establish the time frame within which the bruising occurred and creating a timeline which could assist you with this. So points to look at if you're looking through the tool is this, if this is a one-off incident, and there is an explanation for the bruising following a discussion with the night staff who has not reported a fall accurately, then there is a need to address the importance of recording with that member of staff. Then it would be appropriate to look at a low to medium risk, with the action being increased training for that staff member and updating Peter's care plan and risk assessment. If, however, the bruising does not have an explanation and there is no initial reason for the bruising, then further investigation is required. You would need to consider contacting the police, as the bruising could be an indicator of physical assault, and this would need to be considered as a high. If further bruising is identified on other residents without an explanation, then it would be necessary to raise a safeguarding alert as a high risk, and there you may need to consider the risk to your residents and determine whether staff suspension is required. The initial information gathering would allow for any understanding of how the bruising occurred and to understand whether any abuse had occurred.
The next case study we're going to talk through is Karen. Karen is receiving a care package of 3 calls a day commissioned by Stockport Council. On a review visit, Karen discloses that her carer has taken money from her purse without permission. Karen is not able to leave her property independently and supported weekly to collect her pension through a commissioned call. She wants to keep her money in her own purse, which is kept in her bag, and Karen always keeps that bag with her. Karen does not have many visitors as her family live far away. So again, think about what do you need to know to guide the level of risk, and what questions do we need to ask to gain that information? So for Karen, we might want to consider, is she able to identify the carer in question? Do we know what she saw? Do we know what they did? What level of detail is Karen able to give? Can she give the dates, times, and the amount of money that has gone missing? What does she identify as her own outcomes for this alleged incident? Thinking about making safeguarding personal, what would Karen want to see change as a result of this? What risk assessments are in place for staff supporting her with collecting a pension? What is Karen's capacity around managing her finances? Can you obtain any evidence to explain the incident? For example, are there any receipts we can collect? Can we review any care logs? Can we identify the person or persons who have been supporting Karen to collect her pension? And has that care plan been followed in doing so? Is this the first time that Karen's made this allegation? Do we need to think about calling the police? Is this a theft that we need to report? What safeguards are in place to protect Karen from any future incidences? If we're talking about an allegation of theft that would require sharing information with the police, following this a conversation with the police, they're going to complete an ongoing investigation, and that would be a police-led Section 42 inquiry. Therefore, in this example, we would deem this as high risk, and that safeguarding referral would go into the local authority.
So case study 3 is Helen, and Helen resides in a care home. She has one-to-one care privately funded by her family, as they want Helen to have social interaction during the day to increase her quality of life. Helen loves dancing, and whilst dancing with her one-to-one, she fell backwards, and that resulted in a fall to the ground and fractured hip. Again, looking at what we need to know to guide you for that risk level. What questions do we need to ask to gain this information? So looking at, was there any evidence of abuse or neglect? Triage does not meeting Section 42 criteria, as although the fall resulted in a fracture, there was no evidence of abuse or neglect. Was this fall accidental? Yes, this was an accidental fall doing an activity that Helen enjoyed, and which she had been risk assessed and agreed with the care provider and the family. Looking at other considerations, consideration given to positive risk taking, and we would look at this as a low level risk.
So we've worked through different types of abuse and neglect. We've looked at how we consult with the tool to determine low, medium, and high levels of risk. And we've looked at examples where you would override that and report straight into the local authority. This last slide just looks at what to do once we've completed that tool and been really clear about this specific type of abuse or neglect and the level of risk. So where we've identified that a concern is either amber or red based on your judgment and assessment of that adult situation, we should consider referring the safeguarding concern to the local authority. All safeguarding concerns should be raised to the adult social care portal, where they are triaged by the local authority and any appropriate actions and signposting is taken. There is a link there, and if you download the slides, you can click on that link and it will take you to the local authority portal. There's also more information on the tool and the different types of abuse or neglect in the Stockport Safeguarding Adults Partnership multi-agency policy and procedure document. And again, there's a link to that tool there. Finally, the tool is available on the Stockport Safeguarding Adults Partnership website. The address is there, www.stockport.gov.uk/SSAP. Thank you for listening to the briefing today. We hope you found that information useful. And if you want any more, you can access the tool on the website there.